Okay, so today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Lysander Angerer, the winner of our 2025 Best ECR Article Prize that we gave out in Düsseldorf last year. Michael has just completed his DPhil in English at Oxford and is now a Newby Trust Junior Research Fellow at Clare College in Cambridge. He specializes in medieval multilingualism and translation in England, but has also published more widely on medieval literatures of Northwestern Europe. He has a publication forthcoming in early medieval England and its neighbors, and that is about the knowledge of English in 12th century Scandinavia. And today he will talk to us about poetry, periodization, and the 12th century translation of Cnut's song. So, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining today. I suppose I ought to apologize in advance. Some of this will be a little rough and unpolished still. Much of this material is coming out of my doctoral thesis. Some of it is ongoing research now that I'm on site in Cambridge here, as it were. So just be warned. But our starting point today is a short rhyming poem in English attributed to King Cnut the Great that was included not too long after 1154 in the Latin house chronicle of Ely Cathedral in the East Anglian Fenlands, known as the Liber Eliensis, or the Book of Ely. The Liber Eliensis tells the story of how one Candlemas, King Cnut and Queen Emma were being rowed across the river to the Isle of Ely, when Cnut heard the singing of the monks in what was then the Abbey Church, and this supposedly inspired Cnut to stand up and sing a song of his own in English, of which the Liber Eliensis gives 4 lines in rhyming couplets. This poem is now known as Cnut's Song, and here it is as it's presented in the most recent edition of the Liber Eliensis. Merry sungen the monnikes binnen Ely, where Cnut king rew there be. Roweth Cniches no the land, and here with his monnikes sang. Merry sang the monks within Ely as King Cnut rode by there. Row, knights, closer to the land, and let us hear these monks' song. It's a simple, quaint little song that has frequently been anthologized. Within English literary history, it can stand on either side of this period boundary roughly centered on the Norman conquest that has traditionally been drawn between Old English and Middle English literature. The attribution to King Cnut, of course, makes it tempting to see this poem as a reflection of earlier pre-conquest traditions. Cnut's song has thus been linked to the performance of Old Norse skaldic poetry at Cnut's court, or it has even been taken as evidence of the existence of a kind of saga-like prosimetrum, that's to say a narrative that combines prose with short insertions in poetry in early medieval England. But alternatively, Cnut's song has also been held up as the earliest post-conquest evidence of an English lyric, and it's often discussed as part of the beginnings of Middle English verse. And yet, fundamentally, these attempts to make the poem fit within established period boundaries mainly serve to obscure its most immediate literary context. This is, of course, a problem that's quite typical of the difficulties that come with the rigid periodization of English literature into pre-conquest and post-conquest, and which have recently been addressed by Mark Faulkner in his New Literary History of the Long 12th Century, as well as Elaine Treharne in her Disrupting Categories. But it also, in a way, follows from a traditional practice of editing English lyrics by, as artist Butterfield has it, plucking English items out of what is often a densely bi- or trilingual context. In this case, we have to note that in all 3 surviving manuscripts, the English text of Cnut's song is followed by a Latin version of the poem that has until now been completely ignored. And as we'll see, it is doubtful whether it's the English version that came first. It could well have been included very deliberately, in the same way that Mark Faulkner has identified a 12th century English translation of a Latin diploma supposedly by King Cnut at Christ Church, Canterbury, to play on the symbolic force of English as a reflection of pre-conquest practice. And that lends authority to historical claims. We should, I think, be careful not to be taken in too easily by such claims. As we look at the wider context of 12th century English poetry, Cnut's song underscores the importance of recognizing the interplay between different literary languages that can significantly complicate our understanding of English literary history and its continuity across languages and conquests. But let's start with some background on the Liber Eliensis as a whole. The Book of Ely is a type of local house chronicle, which, as Jennifer Paxton argues, formed the basis for a sort of textual community that would draw the surrounding lay people into the orbit of the monastic house. It does that by frequently tying notable individuals and their donations and legacies back to the religious community. Another key purpose is to assert the rights and privileges that this community has accrued over the centuries. And for that, the chronicle brings together a wide range of different sources in different languages. The Liber Eliensis draws on a wealth of historical works and charters in Latin and Old English. These notably also include a recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, close to the surviving E-text known today as the Peterborough Chronicle. The Liber Eliensis was made up of 3 books, which were probably compiled in 3 stages after 1131, 1154, and 1169. Cnut's song within this appears in chapter 85 of Book 2, so compiled after 1154. It's worth noting before we get to Cnut's song proper that the Latin prose narrative of the Liber Eliensis has also itself been connected to Old English poetry. Earlier in Book 2, it gives an account of the death of Ealdorman Byrhtnoth, of whom it says, "Cuius vitam et gesta non parvis preconiis Anglice commendabant historia de quibus pauca excepimus," whose life and deeds histories in English commended with no small praises, from which we have excerpted a little. This may well be a reference to the Old English poem on the Battle of Maldon, which commemorates Byrhtnoth's death in battle against Viking raiders in 991. That said, only few traces of the poem remain in the prose chronicle, although one formulation does recall similar wordings in the Battle of Maldon. According to the Liber Eliensis, Byrhtnoth engages the raiders in battle, ne hostilis exercitus saltem unum passum pedis se absente occuparet, lest the enemy host should occupy as much as 1 footstep of land in his absence. And that parallels the Old English poem's repeated insistence on the defender's vows not to fleon fotestrum, flee a footstep, or fleogan fotme landes, flee a foot of land. Significant divergences in the narrative, however, including the fact that the Liber Eliensis depicts 2 separate battles instead of 1, lead Thomas D. Hill to conclude that the chronicler did not know the poem directly. Alternatively, it's also possible that the chronicler didn't understand or remember it correctly, which will also account for the fact that the Liber Eliensis very carefully manages its distance between this Latin text and the Old English source, which the compiler notes, "Nos exigui et elinguis arido sermone non sine pudore narramus." We, inadequate and speechless, do not without shame narrate in dry language. But that changes dramatically when we get to the episode about King Cnut and his visit to Ely. The chronicler doesn't just attribute Cnut's song to Cnut directly, but also emphasizes that the English poem is reproduced exactly within the Latin text. The Liber Eliensis insists that ipsemet ore proprio iucunditatem cordis exprimens cantilenam his verbis Anglice composuit dicens, cuius exordium sic continetur. He himself, expressing with his own mouth the joy of his heart, composed a song in these words, in English, of which the beginning is thus preserved. But things aren't quite as straightforward as modern editions of Cnut's song suggest. The part of the Liber Eliensis with the English poem survives in 3 manuscripts today, 2 from the end of the 12th century, both now in Cambridge, and 1 from the end of the 13th century at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Here we have Cnut's song as it's presented in one of the Cambridge manuscripts, Cambridge University Library, Ely Dinam Chapter 1. Again, the text, Meri sungen the Monicus bin an Eli, tha cut king ru there be, Roeth knittes nur the land, and herewith as Munekes sang. Textually speaking, there's certainly nothing to indicate that Cnut's song belongs, as one literary historian suggests, strictly speaking still to the Anglo-Saxon period, or indeed that it has anything at all to do with Old Norse poetic practices at the court of King Cnut. Never mind the fact that the Liber Eliensis' story about King Cnut cannot physically be true either, because as Janet Fairweather notes in her translation, it's impossible to hear any singing inside the cathedral from the waterside. This is a poem clearly written in 12th century English, and in a loosely rhyming form quite characteristic of 12th and 13th century English poetry. It's not lineated in verse lines, but it does follow the usual 12th century practice of punctuating every line with a punctus. Although in this case, after the third line at Lant, the punctus may have been erased when part of the text was corrected. We must note that visually here, Cnut's song is fully integrated into the surrounding Latin chronicle. In this respect, all three manuscripts follow the larger pattern identified by Matthew Aiello, who has shown that manuscripts across the long 13th century do not tend to present English as in any way subordinate to Latin. The script used for both is fundamentally the same, and as Aiello has it, alterations are restricted to using letter forms specific to the vernacular and are not otherwise different in style of execution or general aspect, and should therefore not be qualified as separate scripts. For the English text, the scribe makes use of the exclusively English letters thorn, eth, win, and ash, but otherwise the poem is visually part of the fabric of the Liber Eliensis. And this now becomes especially important when we consider what immediately follows Cnut's song in the Liber Eliensis, namely a Latin version of the poem that has somehow been overlooked. This Latin rendition of Cnut's song is introduced with the words quod Latine sonat, which in Latin sounds like, implying a direct equivalence between the two versions of the poem. But that isn't reflected in editions. Both the most recent editor and translator of the Liber Eliensis choose to lay out the English text in verse lines and the Latin as prose. The fact of the matter is, however, that the Latin, and we'll see in a second, can just as well be laid out in verse lines, which produces a very respectable Latin rhyming poem. Dulce cantaverunt monachinae dum canotus rex navigaret probibi. Nunc militis navigate propius ad terram, et simula audiamus monachorum harmoniam. These Latin lines scan and rhyme suspiciously regularly, and you might say a bit better than the English version. Their poetic structure is even clearly marked by punctuation, as here the first line of each couplet ends on a punctus elevatus, while the second rhyming line ends on a punctus. This practice of alternating between a punctus elevatus and a punctus was long used for Latin psalms and then Latin verse. But over the course of the 12th century, it was also first adopted in Anglo-Norman French, as you can see here in a manuscript of Benedict's 12th century Voyage of St. Brendan, and then English poetry, with possibly the earliest English example in the Ormulum. It was also notably adopted in the two 13th century manuscripts of Laarmann's Brut. In the case of Cnut's song, we might then be forgiven for asking ourselves, what if it was the Latin poem that came first and the English version is a back translation? Certainly it can't stand separately in the way that modern editions present it. And it'll be helpful to take a wider perspective on this kind of transmission of poems as part of larger texts. Perhaps the best known example for this, of course, I forgot to show you Laarmann, here he is. But as the best known example, of course, of this kind of transmission of poetry within historical text, there would be the Old English literative poem known as Caedmon's Hymn, which classically tends to open histories of Old English literature. The story of the shepherd Caedmon and his divinely inspired hymn is told by Bede in his Latin Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, completed around 731. But Bede is very clear that he can only give a Latin prose paraphrase of the poem, and the Old English poem does not form part of the Historia Ecclesiastica's main text. The Old English text of Caedmon's hymn does often appear as an addition in the margins or at the end of the Historia Ecclesiastica in manuscripts from the 8th century on, such as here in what's known as the Moor Bede. It has been suggested that this may in fact be a back translation from the Latin. On the whole, however, that's rather unlikely. Most importantly, as Catherine O'Brien O'Keeffe has shown, Caedmon's hymn seems to have been transmitted quite separately from the textual tradition of the Historia Ecclesiastica, This is a poem that does seem to have circulated outside of its chronicle context. A much later example is that of the hymns of the early 12th century hermit Godric of Finchale. These are also short, rhyming songs that survive in both English and Latin versions, sometimes accompanied by musical notation, as in the case of this manuscript in the British Library. But they are inserted in a variety of Latin texts on the life of Godric of Finchale. The rhyming form of Godric's songs is likely modelled on Latin hymns. But again, here the Latin translation of Godric's songs are clearly prose translations that don't reproduce their English verse forms. Indeed, in this manuscript here, you can see quite clearly that the Latin was added by a much later hand underneath only a part of Godric's English hymn, which establishes a clear textual hierarchy. Last but not least, Helen Deeming has made a powerful internal argument against the possibility of a back translation. As she points out, this song here includes a pun on Godric's name and its similarity to Goddess Riche, or God's realm, that only works in English. Help fin Godric, onfang bring heilige with thee in Goddess Riche. Help your Godric receive and bring him gloriously into God's kingdom. All that is quite different from the situation of Cnut's song, which only survives in its proper place as part of the Liber Eliensis. None of the three surviving manuscripts are direct copies of each other, but there is some evidence that they all ultimately depend on a single written exemplar for the text of Cnut's song. Here we have the second Cambridge manuscript from the end of the 12th century, Cambridge Trinity College 021. Most striking, perhaps, is that, like all manuscripts, it gives Cnut's name, that's the end of the last line on the first folio, that's the top image. It gives Cnut's name as Chut, C-H-U-T. This highly idiosyncratic spelling probably goes back to a misreading of N as H that turned Cnut into Kut. And that might suggest an exemplar written in a 12th century Proto-Gothic script with very short ascenders that would make such a misreading easier. The other idiosyncrasies of Cnut's song have somewhat puzzled scholars who have tended to agree with the assessment of Walter William Skeat from 1896 that the poem was clearly written by an Anglo-Norman scribe whose pronunciation of English was imperfect. This is especially based on the spelling ch for the sound k in Municus and king, as well as the spelling of knites for knichtes. Still, we have to be careful of giving into what Cecily Clarke termed the myth of the Anglo-Norman scribe, which she argued is ritually invoked whenever any seemingly un-English usage appears in a post-conquest document. Really, somewhat erratic spellings in the wake of the obsolescence of the late West Saxon written standard aren't hugely surprising, but we may pick out one instance of what looks like hypercorrection, the spelling of sang with ash for sang in the last line, which is here at the end of the first line of the second image. Such spellings as Faulkner notes do suggest a conscious attempt to imitate an earlier spelling system. The same goes for the two Cambridge manuscripts' relatively late use of insular letter forms, and especially Trinity College 021 here, which, as you can see, gradually shifts into using insular R, and then also adds otiose flourishes that look almost like abbreviation marks and cedillas to H and E at the top of the second leaf. Perhaps Cnut's song looks idiosyncratic precisely because its scribes attempted to make it look more ancient than it actually is. That, at least, might be comparable to some archaizing practices that we see in the copying of pre-conquest charters in the 12th century. This can obviously be employed to lend additional authority to the chronicle's historical claims, and there's an obvious 12th century precedent for this kind of thing, and this kind of use of an English poem. We can compare the way Cnut's song is presented in the Liber Eliensis with the inclusion of the short Old English alliterative poem known as Bede's Death Song in Simeon of Durham's Libellus de Exordio, a Latin history of Durham Cathedral compiled before 1115. The Libellus incorporates the early medieval Latin text of a letter by the Northumbrian monk Cuthbert, in which he narrates Bede's death and also includes Bede's death song in Old English. But the Libellus makes several changes to the text of Cuthbert's letter that explicitly draw attention to the importance of the English language. To the letter's mention, this is a manuscript of the Libellus, to the letter's mention that Bede recited texts in nostra quoque lingua, also in our language, the Libellus adds hoc est Anglica, that is, English. it also specifies that Bede composed Hoc Anglico Carmine, this English song. Then it gives a Latin prose translation of Bede's death song, which no other versions of Cuthbert's letter do, and it prefaces this translation with the familiar phrase, quod ita Latine sonat, which in Latin sounds like this. Essentially, the Libellus de Exordio very deliberately uses this poem to point at a temporal and linguistic disjunction, only to then immediately bridge it. And that is probably part of what David Rollison calls the Libellus' strategy of laying claim to the saintly traditions of Cuthbert, Oswald, Aidan, and Bede, by providing directly linked textual evidence, and then also making it comprehensible to a wide variety of audiences, whether they were able to read Old English or not. There's no evidence the compiler of the Liber Eliensis had access to Simeon of Durham's Libellus de Exordio, but I do think the overall strategy is quite similar. So in a reversal of the situation of Cadman's hymn or the hymns of Godric of Finchale, it doesn't seem unlikely that the English text of Cnut's song is in fact a 12th century back translation from the Latin. Still, it may be best not to get too hung up on which version came first. The subsequent comment in the Liber Eliensis that these verses usque hodie in choris publice cantantur et in proverbiis memorantur are to this day publicly sung in choirs and remembered in proverbs, can apply equally to the English and the Latin in both learned and unlearned contexts. And it's only when put together that these two versions of Cnut's song, the English and the Latin, work together to open the chronicler's account of Cnut's visit to Ely to multiple audiences and to endow it with multilingual authenticity and authority. What it really is a bilingual song in English and Latin that can claim to provide direct evidence of Cnut's visit and make it easily and widely accessible to multilingual 12th century audiences. In short, our periodization problems are based on a quite deliberate textual strategy in the Liber Eliensis. In fact, if we take another look at the rest of the Liber Eliensis, Cnut's song isn't even the only instance of bilingualism being employed in this way. The Liber Eliensis is not above including forged documents, such as a forged Latin charter of King Edward the Confessor, but it also contains an authentic bilingual English and Latin writ of King Edward. The English text of this writ is given first, as in the case of Cnut's song, beginning, as you see here, Edward König ret alla mina bishopas och mina örlas och mina skirjerevan och alla mina theinas och den skiran der det land tollikat into heli frandliche och det kyde eo that ich habe je unnen wulfriche that abodriche heli on erland thingan. King Edward gives friendly greetings to all my bishops and my earls, and my sheriffs and all my thanes in the shires in which lands lie that belong to Ely. And I inform you that I have granted Wulfrich the abbacy of Ely in all things. And unlike in the case of Cnut's song, here the Liber Eliensis specifically says that the writ has been translated into Latin as part of the Liber's compilation. The following Latin translation then also preserves Old English legal terms, such as infangantheof, the right to apprehend and try thieves, fichtwite and verdwite, the authority to fine for fighting and for neglect of military service. Here too, obviously, the point of the bilingual presentation is to emphasize the ancient nature of those rights, as well as their continued applicability. Ernest Oscar Blake, when editing the Liber Eliensis, thought it most useful for its collection of documentary material illustrating the domestic history of Ely, its growth, and the allocation of its possessions when the abbey was elevated to cathedral status in 1109. But that should also make us very suspicious of the historical claims that the story of King Cnut and his song makes. Ely Cathedral naturally had a particular interest in integrating the Danish descendant Cnut into the multilingual history of 12th century England, in the same way that Cnut himself had made strategic use of English to assert his authority in England in the early 11th century. And that's because immediately following Cnut's song, the Liber Eliensis records that on the occasion of his visit to Ely, Cnut bona a predecessoribus suis anglorum regibus ecclesiae colate suo privilegio et auctoritate ad perpetuam munivit firmitatem. He confirmed the goods given to the church by his predecessors as kings of the English in perpetual firmness by his charter and authority. Emily Winkler has noted that 12th century sources tend to stress Cnut's personal legitimacy as an English king, minimizing the rupture of 1016. And in practice here, the story of King Cnut functions much like the bilingual writ of Edward the Confessor. The insertion of Cnut's alleged poem in two languages very carefully positions Cnut as a thoroughly English king within a thoroughly multilingual English culture, whose permanent grants to Ely Cathedral are permanently integrated into the wider multilingual historical record of England. The whole point is to minimize any rupture caused by the conquests of the 11th century, but it's a point easily missed when trying to fit a poem into established literary periods. Finally, zooming out a little, we can see that Ely is hardly the only place to employ these kinds of multilingual tactics. Another prime example would be Christchurch, Canterbury, where Mark Faulkner has drawn attention to a bilingual diploma ascribed to King Cnut that supposedly gives Christchurch control of the port of Sandwich. As Faulkner has it, the English text of this diploma is clearly post-conquest, providing a translation that even emulates the style of the Latin diploma. But the point is that he argues for a pre-conquest document to be in English in itself made its claims more plausible. English here stands for continuity rather than rupture, but only because it is fully integrated into a complex, wider multilingual context, which we ignore at our own peril. And the same dynamics are at play in some further examples of 12th century Canterbury history writing. One of them is the criminally understudied bilingual version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, known as Manuscript F. But another case in which preconceived ideas of multilingualism and periodization can lead us to oversimplify things is the well-known rhyming English poem on King William the Conqueror, The Rime of King William, that now survives in the entry for 1086 of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's Manuscript E, the Peterborough Chronicle. This was probably composed at Christchurch, Canterbury, where the Peterborough Chronicle's exemplar can be located at the end of the 11th century. It begins with the impressive line Castellas heled wirtjan, und arme mens with a swentjan. He had castles built and poor men sorely oppressed. And it's often read as expressing English protest against Norman oppression. Under the influence of this compelling image, its unusually early, purely rhyming form has naturally also been ascribed to the influence of Old French rhyme, highlighting a narrative of foreign imposition. And yet, as Stefan Jarosinski has shown, what we have here is a thoroughly literate production tied into Latin forest polemics. Nor is the origin of the rhyme quite as clear-cut. Rhyming couplets are actually not that common in Old French before the 12th century. I've pointed out before that loosely rhyming half-lines had by then also long become the dominant verse form in continental Germanic literatures, so that the influence could as well have been Dutch or German. But even more likely, perhaps, is simply the influence of Latin rhyming couplets, such as the Latin diameter of Ambrosian hymns, which is also what provided the model for the later emergence of the octosyllabic rhyming couplet as a dominant form for narrative poetry in Anglo-Norman French. In short, it's all more fluid and complicated than simple models of distinct periods and their distinct languages allow for. And to return to Cnut's song, this bilingual poem in the Liber Eliensis, I'll borrow Elaine Treharne's description of the similarly problematic 12th century poem, The Grave. It disrupts boundaries rather than reinforcing them. What we have is not an ancient relic of the Old English period or an original forerunner of Middle English lyrics, but rather a multilingual text that deliberately performs continuity across the rupture that has become so entrenched through our modern period boundaries. Cnut's song is neither first nor last, but it is firmly rooted in a vibrant culture of literary and linguistic interchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And